This week on Jerusalem Dateline, it's an Easter celebration like no other in the Holy Land.
Now the roads are empty. We won't have practically any outdoor activity.
And the Israel Defense Forces takes its stand on the front lines against an invisible enemy. Plus, CBN's broadcast of an Easter service from Jerusalem's Garden Tomb with the timeless message of the resurrection. All this and more this week on Jerusalem Dateline. Hello and welcome to this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Chris Mitchell. The coronavirus has changed the way churches around the world celebrate their Holy Week services. That's also true here in the city where it all began. This is what Good Friday usually looks like on the Via Dolorosa, Latin for the Way of Suffering, where Christian pilgrims from all over the world come to retrace the steps of Jesus on his way to his crucifixion on the cross. This year on Good Friday, the Via Dolorosa here in the heart of Jerusalem will be empty, since all outdoor processions have been canceled by the government because of COVID-19.
Usually in such seasons, the city is overloaded with people. Now the roads are empty. We won't have practically any outdoor activity. All prayers will be held with very, very minimal participations.
The same holds true here in the Garden Tomb, just outside the walls of Jerusalem's Old City, where many people believe Jesus was laid in this empty tomb and then rose from the dead. The Garden Tomb Association has held Easter sunrise services for years, many of them broadcast by CBN.
Normally there are thousands here on Easter morning, but this year we could only allow 4 people on camera at a time. And so we had to have people come in at different times to do the readings, different times to do the music, to make sure that restrictions were adhered to. Well, the Easter service we have planned now is going to be a mix of readings from some of the community who are still here, of prayers, of praying for those victims and those who are suffering with the virus.
Abu Nasser says, despite the circumstances, there's cause for hope.
It is a very sad moment, but I do believe that it is also an opportunity for prayer and reflection, because God could be adored everywhere, not only in the holy place. St. Paul says everything is working for the sake of those who love God. I believe that God and the divine wisdom might require us to reflect and to pray more. And I do believe that this is an opportunity for the families, especially nucleus families, to pray more, to reflect more.
It will look very different to previous years, obviously because there are no people allowed to attend it. But we still believe that is still an act of worship to God, because the ministry of the Garden Tomb is about a place of worship and witness and prayer. And that will continue even through this virus.
Regardless of the government restrictions because of the coronavirus, Abu Nasser and Holland say the message of Easter remains the same.
That we believe in resurrected Lord, and death, even despite all difficulties, Easter reflects that life would prevail, that death and crucifixion is only one station on our way to resurrection.
As we read in John's Gospel, chapter 19, not far from where Jesus was crucified there was a garden, and in the garden there was a tomb. And we read therefore that Jesus was crucified for our sins to take away the sin of the world, and that he rose again on the 3rd day. And this is a message of hope that we can give to the world. The message of the gospel stays the same, and that message that the Garden Tombs proclaimed for 126 years, that Jesus died, that Jesus was buried, and that Jesus rose again for everyone who's listening to this message today and the whole world.
Here in Israel, the government is cautiously optimistic they can lift some of the coronavirus restrictions. Yet travel between cities is still restricted, and the government will also require everyone to wear a protective mask in public. Israel also says it has a COVID-19 exit plan to gradually lift restrictions as long as infection rates remain under control. So far, more than 10,000 Israelis have tested positive for the coronavirus, and sadly, more than 80 people have died. As COVID-19 forces the world to think out of the box, people are taking on roles they've never imagined. CBN Middle East correspondent Julie Stahl shows us that includes Israel's defense forces.
From high-tech warfare against rockets from Gaza and Hezbollah tunnels to cybersecurity and troops on the ground, the Israel Defense Forces is cutting edge. Now, due to COVID-19, the IDF has expanded its mission.
A key part of the national situation is to provide information. So there are call centers that have been manned by IDF personnel together with Magen David Adom and with the Ministry of Health and other officials.
Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Conriquez says while it's early in the process, the IDF is rolling with the changes.
It's really an overall effort with different parts of the IDF, the logistic teams, the medical corps, and even technological units that are providing novel adaptations to existing technologies, for instance, adapting different ventilators to hospital use.
And there's more.
Another effort that we are part of, again through the Homefront Command, which is part of the IDF, is to refit hotels as makeshift hospitals or centers for quarantine and treatment of those suffering from mild symptoms.
Another mission is to help the elderly, needy, and at-risk populations.
IDF soldiers are going door to door, providing food, medicine, and any other services as an assistance needed to various parts of Israel, different low-income neighborhoods, and the elderly and people who need that assistance.
One of those soldiers is Sergeant Roni Corin in the Homefront Command Search and Rescue Unit.
I think everyone's having a really hard time right now. And at the end of the day, we're the people who are here to help the people of Israel.
The IDF is providing both prepared meals and boxes of groceries to those in need.
Every house I've been to, everyone who comes up to us, everyone who opens the door is always happy to see us. I think it's an amazing thing to be doing, to be able to help these people who have it even harder during these times.
Corin says even though times are tough, that shouldn't stop people from reaching out.
There's a great opportunity in seeing the good in this and trying to help, because I feel like at the end of the day, even though we're socially distanced, we're here for one another. I think during these hard times, we shouldn't take social distancing ourselves and not wanting to help.
In addition to the humanitarian aid, the IDF has also stepped in to help the Israeli police enforce the lockdown. But Conriquez says the IDF's first mission remains the same.
First, continue to defend the state of Israel. None of our enemies have dissolved, and they will continue to try to kill Israeli civilians the day after they finish reeling from the results of the virus. As such, we need to stand guard along our borders 24/7, and that is what we're doing, and that is priority number one.
Julie Stahl, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Up next, resurrection, fact or fiction? CBN's Paul Strand takes a look. Skeptics have refuted the resurrection of Jesus Christ ever since that first Easter morning. CBN's Paul Strand brings us this report about how some are taking on today's skeptics.
Christianity's power all hinges on the fact of the resurrection. But detractors for centuries have come up with scenarios to explain away the reality of the resurrection. One is the wrong tomb theory. Everyone just went to the wrong tomb, an empty one, and assumed Christ had resurrected. Indiana Dr. Joseph Bergeron studied the crucifixion of Christ and its aftermath for 10 years.
Going to a wrong tomb and finding it empty doesn't present to anybody's mind that the person resurrected from the dead.
Alex McFarland is another top defender of the faith at events like Bible camps and apologetics conferences. He points out another well-known fact.
Pilate had dispatched a cadre of Roman soldiers to guard the tomb.
So everybody knew where it was.
There's also the swoon theory that wants you to believe instead of dying on the cross, Jesus only passed out, woke up in the tomb a couple of days later, rolled away the huge stone, and escaped. McFarland says impossible.
Christ has been at least 2 to 3 days without food or water, dehydrated. He was beaten severely, huge loss of blood, nailed to the cross.
And if the always fatal crucifixion process hadn't already killed him, Roman soldiers made sure.
They plunged a spear into his chest because to allow any possibility that he would survive the crucifixion would mean that they would die themselves.
McFarland explains the swoon theorists then present this unlikely scenario.
He revived himself, he moves, a 2.5 to 3 ton stone. He overcomes a dozen Roman soldiers in peak physical condition.
McFarland also sees a moral problem with what the swoon theorist wants you to believe.
He told his disciples he had risen, and he allowed them to go forth and preach what was false and die for what really wasn't true. This compromises the moral, righteous nature of the person Jesus.
The stolen body theory proposes that the very disciples who fled in terror after the crucifixion then risked death to steal Christ's body from the tomb, and then made up the whole resurrection story.
They sufficiently regather and summon up enough bravery to overcome Roman soldiers. I mean, this could have been, at best, arrest, if not execution and death. They move the stone, they take away the body of Jesus, they say he's risen.
But that would have been the opposite of Jesus' life and teaching.
Everything he's all about is predicated on righteousness, virtue, truth, holiness. Here is truth personified, and they build a gospel on a lie. Just doesn't make sense.
And all but one of those disciples was put to death for this gospel.
People sometimes will die for some misguided belief that they have. Nobody dies for a hoax.
One popular idea is that everyone who saw Jesus alive after his death was just hallucinating. Bergeron points out, though, in the rare documented cases of group hallucinations, they all see different things.
None of them experience the same exact thing.
Because it's all in their mind. McFarland points out the risen Christ appeared several times and interacted with hundreds of people, as recorded in 1 Corinthians 15.
Paul says he was seen by up to 500 brethren at once.
Hallucination hypotheses can never explain the group appearances, the group experiences the disciples had with Jesus.
Hallucinations are not contagious. Hallucinations generally don't appear in different places to different groups of people. You generally can't talk and converse with an hallucination, and you certainly can't eat with an hallucination.
So why not just believe in what the Son of God promised he'd do? Resurrection.
His identity, message, credentials were validated by the fact that he did what none of us could do under our own power. He rose from the dead.
I'm more convinced that what we believe as Christians is true and accurate than I ever have been.
Like so many others across the millennia, Bergeron contends the best explanation for why Jesus wasn't in that tomb Easter morning is what Christ's disciples have always said. He came alive and rose from it. Paul Strand, CBN News, reporting from Indiana.
Here's one U.S. church that took the Easter message to new heights. Take a look.
Just follow the E.
Some directed traffic.
Back up, back up, back up, back up. And you're good.
Others lined up each car just right as members of 12 Virginia churches rolled up with their masks on and maintaining strict social distancing guidelines to send the world an Easter message.
In the middle of this pandemic, there's hope, that there's strength, and that we will make it through this. Because he has risen, so will we.
On a stretch of road in Chesapeake, dozens of cars lined up to spell the words, "He is risen."
I think with as much desperation and anxiety going on in the world at this time, people are looking for hope, and it's a great opportunity for us to get out there and love our neighbors and share the love of Jesus with them.
As the emotional and physical toll of the COVID-19 outbreak rises, folks here want their fellow Americans not to lose heart.
God is with us. That same spirit that raised Jesus from the dead is with us in this really terrible time.
Pastor Bob Fox organized the event to encourage congregations to reach a hurting world during times of uncertainty.
This is an opportunity for us to go forward, not just to be passive and just try to wait it out, but to really listen to the Lord. The Lord wants to use this time to take the church to new levels of expressing the gospel.
And it's happening. Research shows a huge spike in online searches relating to faith, God, and the Bible since the viral outbreak started.
We've seen big upticks in searches around fear and anxiety. We've also seen record levels of people sharing scripture.
Fox says while this event is a symbolic gesture of unity,
and also just to get out, take the gospel outside the walls. Since we can't get in the walls, we have to take it outside the walls.
As the coronavirus pandemic continues to bear down across the globe, the drivers of these 49 cars are hoping that the words "He is risen" will bring hope in the midst of this historic season of fear, anxiety, and widespread isolation. George Thomas, CBN News, Chesapeake, Virginia.
Coming up, a look at the palace where some archaeologists say Pilate judged Jesus. Just before he was crucified, Pontius Pilate and King Herod confronted Jesus. As John Waggy reports from several years ago, archaeologists discovered the palace where they believe it all took place.
At the western edge of the old city, the Tower of David stands above the walls. 16 years ago, archaeologists found a building while working on the Tower of David Museum. Records on its walls go back even before the time of Jesus and the Roman governor who sentenced him to the cross, Pontius Pilate. For years, experts suggested that Pilate handed down his death sentence from Antonia's fortress on the other side of the city, where the Roman soldiers were housed. But recent evidence uncovered here at the site of King Herod's palace indicates that the luxury-loving Pilate was more likely to have pronounced judgment here. Archaeologist Amit Re'em helped discover the palace site in 1999. He's familiar with the history on these walls, from Herod's time until the British put a prison on it in the 1940s.
Until now, those impressive walls are the only remains from Herod's palace. We do not know what happened to the superstructures, to the palace itself. Maybe it was destroyed in the big revolt. Maybe it was destroyed by the Romans. Maybe it was destroyed by the Crusaders or the Ottoman.
We don't know exactly where Jesus was tried, where he had his interview before Pontius Pilate, but we know it's somewhere in Herod's palace.
David Pileggi is pastor of Christ Church, just steps away from the site.
We know that the palace of Herod the Great eventually became Roman property after Herod's death, and that every year Pontius Pilate would come from Caesarea to Jerusalem here during the time of Passover to oversee the security of the city during the festival that the Jews called the Feast of Freedom. And it was at this time where if there was going to be trouble in Jerusalem, it would be during the Passover holiday.
Pileggi says that in a way, the Tower of David encompasses the entire life story of Jesus.
Scholars had been saying for half a century that the life of Jesus begins at the Tower of David, or what was then Herod's palace. That's when the Magi come to visit King Herod. And his life ends basically when Pontius Pilate sentences him to death, pretty much in the same location. So there's some very interesting irony in this story.
Israeli archaeologist Renee Sivan is still struck by its power and opulence, even though she helped begin the digging.
Jerusalem is like an onion. You peel it, peel it, peel it, and it never ends. But then you cry a bit, but not too much. That is what happens here.
Pileggi calls the Tower of David the best museum in the city and says tourists would do well to start their journey here.
Now we have the extra bonus of having the very place where Jesus was sent to execution by Pontius Pilate, and this will help Christians better visualize those monumentous events that happened to Jesus the Messiah, Jesus of Nazareth, in the last week of his life.
And just a couple of miles away, the Mount of Olives, where Scripture says he'll come again. John Waggy, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Still ahead, CBN helps Israelis during the COVID-19 crisis. COVID-19 has had a devastating impact on Israeli families just struggling to make ends meet in the best of times. That's where CBN Israel came in to help. Take a look.
Hello everybody, we are on the way to the north to give coupons for people they stuck at home and they don't have food. Every day we are trying to go to other places. Today we are on the way to Haifa.
I wanted to thank you so much for your heart-warming gift. This was so special.
אנחנו מאוד מודים לכם בזמן הקשה שאתם חושבים עלינו ועוזרים לנו, ובאמת נותנים את היד, באמת. שאלוהים מברך אתכם. תודה רבה.
Thank you.
And another day of helping to people.
Well, that's all for this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. Thanks for joining us. Remember to pray for those affected by the coronavirus around the world and see how you can be a help to those in need. And remember, you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. I'm Chris Mitchell. We'll see you next time on Jerusalem Dateline. And as they say on Resurrection Day, He is risen. He is risen indeed.